Today, we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal trials in all of history, focusing specifically on the account in Matthew chapter 26. We're going to look closely at verses 57 through 68. And what we're going to see is that this was never a search for the truth. It was a carefully staged event designed from the start to reach one specific conclusion. So right from the get-go, the scene is set in shadows and secrecy. Matthew's account makes it crystal clear that this entire proceeding, this whole court, was set up for one reason and one reason only, to secure a death sentence for Jesus of Nazareth. Justice wasn't even on the table. Okay, so let's jump right in with verse 57. It tells us that right after his arrest, they don't take Jesus to some public courthouse. No, he's taken away to the private palace of the high priest. And the man running this whole show, his name is Caiaphas. And you really have to understand who this guy Caiaphas was. He was less of a spiritual leader and way more of a political player. His main job was to keep the peace, to keep Jerusalem stable for his Roman bosses. This is so important because it tells you everything about his motivation. He's the one who famously argued it was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to be crushed by Rome. To him, Jesus wasn't just a religious figure, he was a political problem that had to go away. And here's a detail from that same verse, verse 57, that just screams, this is a setup. It says the scribes and the elders were already assembled. You have to get this. Holding a capital trial at night was a major violation of their own Jewish law. These trials were supposed to happen in broad daylight. So the fact that they're all there, it means they weren't just summoned. They were waiting. The whole thing was prearranged. All right, that brings us to Act 2. So you've got the prisoner, you've got this illegal court all gathered in the middle of the night, but they've got a huge problem. What do you do when you have your defendant, but you don't actually have a crime? Well, verse 59 lays this out in plain sight. It is shockingly direct. It says the chief priests and the whole council were actively seeking false witness against Jesus to put him to death. They weren't weighing evidence they already had. They were literally trying to manufacture a crime from scratch. And you know what? According to verse 60, their whole plan, well, it was falling apart. Even though they got plenty of liars to come forward, none of their stories matched up. And that was a huge problem for them, because under their law, to convict someone of a capital offense, you needed at least two witnesses whose stories agreed. Their case was crumbling. That is, until two guys finally come forward with a twisted version of something they heard Jesus say. So in verse 61, we see what they finally land on. This quote. Now, Jesus had said something kind of like this, but he was speaking metaphorically. He was talking about the temple of his own body, referring to his death and resurrection. But these witnesses, they twist it. They make it sound like he was making a literal threat to destroy the actual physical temple in Jerusalem, which would have been seen as treason. Caiaphas sees his chance. Verse 62 tells us he stands up, gets right in Jesus' face, and demands an answer to the charge. You can see his strategy here, right? He's trying to force a confession, or at least get Jesus to say something that he can use against him. In Jesus' response, it's absolutely stunning. The first part of verse 63 says it all, but Jesus held his peace. He says nothing, not a word, no defense, no denial. And this silence, it must have driven Caiaphas crazy. It completely stalls his plan. The trial grinds to a halt, again. Okay, so this is the moment. This is where the whole trial turns on a dime. Caiaphas is frustrated, his case is collapsing, so he pulls out his ultimate weapon, a sacred legal oath. Later in verse 63, Caiaphas uses this very specific language, I adjure thee by the living God. Now, this isn't just him asking a question, it's a legal move, a power play. By putting Jesus under oath in the name of God, he is legally forcing him to answer. To stay silent now would be to break that oath. Caiaphas is essentially forcing Jesus to testify against himself. And in verse 64, Jesus finally breaks his silence. He starts with, thou hast said, which is basically a way of saying, you said it yourself, it's true. But then he adds a declaration that changes absolutely everything. He's not just accepting a title, he's claiming cosmic authority. And this is the absolute mic drop moment of the whole trial. When he talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, he is quoting directly from a famous prophecy in the book of Daniel. He's standing there, in front of the very court that's trying him, and he's telling them to their faces, you're judging me now, but one day I'm going to be your judge. He completely flips the script. Well, that declaration just lights a fuse. Caiaphas gets exactly what he was hoping for, and his reaction is, let's just say it's big and theatrical. He finally has his confession. So in verse 65, Caiaphas does something really dramatic. He rips his own clothes. This wasn't just a temper tantrum, it was a recognized traditional ritual, a sign of absolute horror, specifically used when someone heard what they believed was blasphemy against God. And then he yells it out for the whole council to hear. He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? It's a masterful move. In their world, claiming the rights or the attributes of God, claiming to be the Son of God who would sit at God's right hand, that was the ultimate crime. Caiaphas is basically saying, we don't need witnesses anymore. We heard it from his own mouth. And just like that, verse 66 tells us, the verdict comes down. Swift, unanimous. He is guilty of death. The sham trial that started in a desperate search for a crime finally had its verdict. But it doesn't end with the verdict. Not even close. What happens next is it's a descent into raw, cruel mockery and a brutal assault on the man they've just condemned. Verse 67 lays out the physical abuse. They spit in his face, they beat him. But then in verse 68, the cruelty gets even more specific, even more ironic. They blindfold him, hit him, and then taunt him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you?" They're mocking the very claim for which they condemned him. And this is where the whole thing just flips on its head. The ultimate irony, right? By their own logic, in the very act of condemning Jesus for what they called blasphemy, the council was committing what the text presents as the greatest blasphemy of all, sentencing the Son of God to death. So we're left with this incredible thought. This whole thing was a sham, set up to condemn one man. But in his final statement, Jesus completely turned the tables on them, declaring a higher, future judgment. And it really forces us to ask, in that palace, in the middle of the night, who was truly on trial?